The sea around the Sibutu Passage, on the night of 6 June 1944, looked ordinary enough. The moon laid a cold bar of light across the water, turning the long swells into dull, moving metal. Wind hissed low along the surface. The sound, to most men, would have felt like a breeze over a quiet channel in peacetime. Down below, 60 or 70 feet under that calm, the war sounded different. Metal complained softly in the pressure. Pumps hummed. A big diesel-electric boat, 301 feet of steel and rivets named USS Harder, moved ahead on battery power at a slow crawl. Her hull creaked and murmured, the little sounds of a ship that had been worked hard and sent out again with only enough time to fix what absolutely needed fixing. Bach Koa Tuan Tu Wikipedia. Commander Samuel David Dealey stood at the periscope, arms braced on the cold steel handles, one eye pressed to the rubber cup. The rest of the control room, cramped and warm and crowded with men and instruments, waited on the way his shoulders moved. He saw it before he could name it. Something big and black against the path of the moon, low on the horizon, making no effort to hide. A column of ships, fat silhouettes under a white sky. Tankers. And around them, shapes that moved differently. Leaner. Restless. Destroyers. He focused on the lead escort, watched the angle on the bow, the crisp way the ship turned when the zigzag pattern reached its next leg. A Navy man could tell a lot from how another captain turned his ship. This one was alert and tight, the sort of man who thought his gear made him invulnerable. In Washington and Tokyo, men had drawn neat arrows on neat maps and agreed that submarines did best ambushing merchant hulls, staying away from the lean ones that shot back. Here, in this narrow strait between Tawi-Tawi and Borneo, the neat logic of that doctrine felt very far away. Harder had been ordered to lurk near the Japanese fleet anchorage at Tawi-Tawi to report what she saw, to pick up a handful of Allied coast watchers off enemy-held shore, and to attack targets of opportunity. On paper, it was a reconnaissance patrol with a secondary duty to harass shipping. In practice, it was a single American submarine, cruising just off the doorstep of the main Japanese fleet base in the region, in water clogged with destroyers that had been built, trained, and armed specifically to kill boats like Harder. Bach Koa Toan Thu Wikipedia. Dealey absorbed the picture in silence. 3 tankers in ballast, 2 escorts. Ao Sibutu ahead, narrow and shallow, lit by a moon that did not care which flag the men beneath it served. "Range?" he asked quietly. The answers came back in low, practiced voices. Bearings, speeds. The familiar math of approach angles filled the room. If he did what was called for in the doctrine of the day, he would back away into the dark, report the ships, look for fatter prey later. Instead, he steadied the periscope on the escort that had just altered course, watched the sharp way its bow cut across the swell. The destroyer was turning toward the moon path, closing speed. They had seen something. He let the periscope slip down and looked around the control room. Men watched him without staring. They had followed him through 4 patrols already. They knew the way his face looked when he'd decided to shoot. "We'll let him come," he said. "Down the throat." There was a short, quiet pause as everyone's mind ran the same picture. A destroyer charging, sonar pinging, depth charges rolled off the stern rails. A submarine, instead of running, pointing its nose right at the threat to fire straight into the teeth of it. A few years earlier, such an idea would have been laughed out of a tactics classroom. Now it was what this commander did often enough that other submariners had started to use his name as shorthand for it. He called the depth himself. The boat slid down a little more, just to periscope depth, just enough to keep the optics out of the spray. The destroyer grew in the lens. The white bow wave brightened. The mastheads sharpened. "Range 1,100 yards," someone said. In the tight air, the sound of the torpedo firing order felt like the opening of a hatch on a winter morning. "Stern tubes, 3 shots, fire." The boat shuddered, once, twice, 3 times. Each steel cylinder left with a flat, gut-level thud that a man learned to feel in his feet and chest more than in his ears. Men counted in their heads. The control room smelled of sweat and battery acid, coffee and old oil. 2 small blooms of white appeared against the destroyer's side. A half-second later, the sea erupted in a heavy, yellow-white column. The escort's bow lifted, then the whole ship heeled over in the moonlight, as if some giant hand had punched it under the ribs. To the men watching through steel and glass, there was only the hard physics of torpedo explosive and plating. Within minutes, the destroyer was gone. 50, maybe 100 men who had believed their ship existed to hunt submarines were in the dark water, and the submarine they had come to kill was already easing down deeper, preparing to endure the hammering of the depth charges that came as predictably as the next tide. In the tight air of the control room, bolts rattled as the first pattern went off. The hull flexed. 2 coffee cups shattered. A man's pencil rolled off the plot table. No one in that compartment knew, on that night, that this was the first move in a 4-day stretch that would be retold for generations as the time one submarine crippled 5 Japanese hunter ships and forced an admiral to move an entire fleet early. They only knew that the boat had fired, hit, and lived through the first counterattack. The impossible part, the idea that this steel cylinder could patrol the doorstep of a major enemy anchorage and deliberately hunt the hunters, was still forming, like a shadow in the back of everyone's mind. The water pressure and the distant thunder of depth charges kept a steady rhythm. Men watched the gauges, counted seconds, and waited for the next set of detonations as the submarine slid away in the darkness below. In Tokyo, the logic that had built those destroyers and sent them south to Tawi-Tawi had taken years to harden. The Japanese Navy had entered the war with a reputation. Night-fighting destroyers, long-range torpedoes, crews drilled to a high polish. Destroyers were not just escorts in this doctrine. They were sharp tools, meant for surface actions and aggressive defense of heavier ships. Anti-submarine work was woven into that role with a confidence that bordered on assumption. The thinking was simple, and from the inside, coherent. A fast, well-handled destroyer with sonar and depth charges should dominate a submerged boat that had to guess its way through the water. Officers in the destroyer force had grown up in that frame. War games had reinforced it. Exercises at sea had given them the feeling. Strong, easy to believe, that a submarine spotted on sonar and pinned by a pattern of charges was as good as dead unless luck stepped in. They were not blind to the danger of submarines. Japanese planners had watched British and German experiences in the First World War. They had read the reports of sinkings with care. But they believed, deep down, that good ships led by good captains with proper equipment could push that danger back beyond the edge of their battle fleet. On the charts in staff rooms and wardrooms, lines of destroyers formed neat screens around carriers and battleships. The diagrams showed detection arcs and engagement envelopes. Sonar beams swept clean, fan-shaped cones through the blue pencil seas. Depth charge tracks traced neat hatchings aft of a destroyer's stern, the geometry of a solved problem. The men who studied those diagrams did not think of it as arrogance. To them, it was professionalism. A captain who did not have faith in his ship and tools had no business standing on a destroyer's bridge at 30 knots in the dark. In 1944, in the weeks before Harder slid out toward Tawi-Tawi, that faith had been reinforced, not shaken. American submarines had been active in the Philippines and Indonesia, but the Japanese fleet still gathered where it chose. Tawi-Tawi with its sheltered anchorages and access to oil from Borneo, looked on the map like a strong position. The destroyers on its approaches, bristling with depth charge racks and sonar domes, felt like a wall. On a destroyer's bridge, the junior officers could see that wall in every contact report. A suspicious echo here, a fleeting sonar trace there, a burst of high-speed maneuvering to roll another pattern. Conning towers and periscopes were rare sights. Most of the work was invisible, listening, believing, and punishing what the instruments suggested. The crews respected the enemy in an abstract way. They accepted that submarines could be dangerous if given room to aim and fire. But the deeper belief, the one that settled into the bones of the men who stood watch night after night, was that their class of ship existed to make that room disappear. In the wardroom talk, American submariners came up as ghosts that could be banished by vigilance, stay sharp with the sonar, keep the lookouts awake, run the zigzag pattern exactly, drop the charges in full patterns, not half. Do all of that, and the submarine would remain what it should be, scared, reactive, and far away from the carriers. At higher levels, the confidence was broader. Admirals reading intelligence summaries and operational reports did not see a destroyer force being hunted. They saw their anti-submarine arm as thinly stretched, perhaps, but conceptually sound. Reinforcements were asked for, not because the tools were failing, but because there were so many approaches to guard. The idea that a single enemy submarine would come to the entrance of their anchorage and choose, deliberately, to stalk and strike the very ships assigned to kill it, that thought did not fit into the pattern. It felt like the sort of thing that happened in novels, not in the carefully organized geometry of fleet dispositions. The system that made that blind spot was not one man's folly. It was a chain, doctrine written years earlier, production priorities set under pressure, training programs built around idealized encounters. Destroyers had been optimized for many tasks at once: screening, torpedo attacks, surface gunfire, and anti-submarine work. Specialized sub-hunters existed on paper, but the men on those decks still thought of themselves as warriors, not technicians. By June 1944, the Japanese Navy knew it was under strain. Fuel was tighter. Aircraft losses hurt. But in their own minds, the destroyer crews and their commanders still stood in a place of assumed advantage whenever the contest narrowed to a race between a fast surface ship and a single submarine in coastal waters. If there was a doubt, it showed itself not in open confession, but in small, unremarkable gestures. An extra charge in the pattern, an order to increase speed a notch, a night when the sonar man kept his headset on, an hour after his watch should have ended. Those were tiny cracks in the surface of an otherwise solid belief. Out near Tawi-Tawi, under the moon, a destroyer charged a contact in the Sibutu Passage, with that belief beneath its boots. The men in that ship did not think they were riding into an ambush. They thought they were doing exactly what their navy existed to do. The shift that made that charge suddenly dangerous to the destroyer and survivable for the submarine had not been born in one night. It had formed in diesel fumes in Pearl Harbor and Fremantle, in loud, overcrowded classrooms where American submariners were told they were not sinking enough. It had evolved in long patrols where boats came back with empty torpedo rooms and bitter stories about duds, then went out again with better exploders and different rules about when to fire and when to run. By the time Harder left Fremantle for her 5th war patrol in late May 1944, the submarine force she belonged to was no longer the cautious, underperforming arm it had been in 1942. It was a sharpened instrument with changing ideas about its own purpose. Bach Koa Tuan Thu Wikipedia. Dealey himself sat in the center of that change. He was not an inventor or an admiral. He was a boat captain with a record. Previous patrols stacked with sinkings, a reputation for coolness, and a way of pressing his luck that made some superiors nervous and most of his peers quietly respectful. Under his command, Harder had taken risks that did not fit neatly into the old textbook diagrams. Inside the steel shell, this shift looked like routine. Men drilled again and again on going from surface to periscope depth in the shortest possible time, on setting up a fire control solution at short range with incomplete data, on reacting when a destroyer unexpectedly turned toward them instead of away. The engine room crews learned the exact sounds the diesels made just before shutting down, the feel of the boat as it coasted on into silence. Torpedomen learned to handle their weapons with more trust than they'd had when duds had plagued the force. The equipment had been improved, and every successful patrol reinforced that confidence. In the plotting party, sailors traced thousands of imagined tracks on laminated charts. Convoy here, escort there, our boat threading through. Again and again, the instructors would work the problem backward. If the destroyer charges, what do you do? If he shows you his bow, what angle do you want? How close is too close? Dealey's own preferences filtered into those drills. He was comfortable with the idea of closing to what older skippers called knife range. 1,000 yards, 800. Less. At those distances, the torpedoes had less time to run astray. The spread could be tighter, the impact surer. The price was exposure. There was less time to turn and dive away. Margin for error narrowed to the point that a single misjudged second could mean a steel hull torn open by a depth charge at point-blank range. The boat's material condition reflected that hard use. Pipes rattled in certain seas. Paint wore thin in passages where men's shoulders rubbed day after day. But the important systems, engines, batteries, pumps, torpedo tubes, periscopes, were tended like beating hearts. A breakdown in quiet coastal water under an enemy anchorage was not a mechanical inconvenience. It was a sentence. Around Tawi-Tawi, the larger Allied machine added its own weight. Reconnaissance aircraft, Coast Watcher reports, code breaking, threads of information came together in staff rooms in Hawaii and Australia. Planners knew where the Japanese fleet was massing. They could guess where it would have to go to reach the Philippine Sea. Submarines like Harder were placed like tripwires and knives along those routes, not just to hit individual targets, but to observe and to unsettle. Harder's assignment to that precise patch of water was not accidental. The boat was being used as both scout and weapon in one of the few places where the Japanese still felt tactically secure. Her advantage lay not in armor or speed, but in the way that larger system could feed her targets and trust her captain's judgment about when to strike. On board, the crew felt the edge of that responsibility without necessarily naming it. They knew their patrol area. They knew the fleet base was only a handful of miles away beyond a chain of islands and shoals. They knew that every destroyer they could damage or sink here would not be screening a carrier somewhere days from now. In the torpedo room, young sailors with oil under their fingernails worked between racks of steel cylinders, loading, checking, and rechecking. Some of them had never seen a destroyer except as a silhouette in a recognition manual. They knew abstractly what depth charges did to steel plates and human bodies. They also knew that their boat's captain had a habit of aiming straight at those ships when others would have slid away. The revelation, if it can be called that, was not a single moment of enlightenment. It was the way all of these threads, improved weapons, aggressive doctrine, experienced leadership, and a broader Allied strategy, came together in the tightness of the Sibutu Passage that week. When Dealey decided to turn into the destroyer's attack instead of away from it, he was putting into practice a new way of thinking about who hunted whom. He was also quietly, without speech or proclamation, testing the proposition that a well-handled submarine with reliable torpedoes and nerves of steel could dominate even the very ships built to kill it if it chose the ground and the moment correctly. In the days that followed, that proposition would be proved not on a blackboard, but in steel, men, and explosions. The destroyer that died first never saw the whole pattern. Her lookout saw a shadow or a flash of periscope in the moon's path, enough to justify the turn and the engine order. Her sonar men heard an echo that thickened and sharpened. The captain stood on the bridge wing or at the chart desk, watching bearing lines converge on a contact that seemed to be right where a submarine ought to be if it had misjudged the moonlight. He ordered flank speed and a straight charge. He trusted his sonar. He trusted his depth charges. The bow gun's crew gripped their weapons pointlessly. This was not a surface gun action. The real work would happen below, where steel drums of explosive would tumble off the stern rails and, in his mind, tear open plates and hull frames. What reached him instead, an instant before the first explosion, was the sight of 3 narrow wakes running toward his bow, fanning slightly from a point in the water he had never seen. The last thing he understood, in that terrible half-second, was that the submarine had pointed itself right at him and fired not in panic, but with calculation. A day later, another destroyer, Hayanami, died in a different patch of the sea, under a different piece of sky. Harder had worked her way back into hunting position after the air patrol that had forced her under. Again, the range was short. Again, the torpedoes ran true. The Japanese ship's magazine went up with such force that Harder's crew, deep down in their own steel hull, felt the concussion as a shove. There was no long agony of a ship burning for hours. The destroyer went down hard and fast, tail first, the sharp bow rearing as if in protest before it vanished. Bach, Koa Toan Thu Wikipedia. Each of these blows carried information back to the Japanese command, but not all at once. Signals were delayed. Reports were fragmentary. Men who might have described the submarine's aggressive tactics were dead in the water or lost with the ship. In the meantime, Harder kept moving. On the 9th, in the confined waters near the passage, Dealey again chose to engage rather than avoid. Current and geography funneled both submarine and destroyer toward each other. This time, the American boat fired a spread at overlapping targets, one destroyer tucked behind another in the narrow channel. One ship, Tanakaze, died almost where she stood, her boilers erupting into the sky. Another took damage that would mark her for the rest of her short life. In those seconds, in that narrow body of water, the neat diagrams on the staff maps collapsed. The hunters were being stalked in their own lanes. A single submarine was not just evading the screen, it was punching holes in it. On shore at Tawi Tawi, reports of explosions and sinking escorts reached headquarters. Some of the staff officers dismissed the first message as bad luck. A submarine might be lurking, and a destroyer might have blundered into a well-timed salvo. By the second and third sinking, that explanation no longer fit. Men who had grown up believing in the protective ring of destroyers around the fleet stared at plots that showed gaps in that ring widening over days, not months. When Harder, having reconnoitered the anchorage itself, sent back detailed reports of ship types and movements, those signals traveled up an allied chain that knew how to use them. Admiral Spruance's staff, preparing for the coming battle in the Philippine Sea, folded those observations into a broader picture that would help them place their carriers and pick their fights. Bach Koa Toan Thu Wikipedia. For the Japanese side, the reality of what was happening arrived not as a grand revelation, but as a growing weight of unease. Admiral Somu Toyota, looking at submarine contact reports and destroyer losses, came to believe that the waters around Tawi Tawi were thick with enemy boats. The mind that had trusted destroyers as a shield now saw them being chipped away. The conclusion was not that a single aggressive submarine captain had found a seam. It was that the area was saturated with threats. That perception led to a decision. The main fleet would not sit and wait at an anchorage that now felt exposed. It would move earlier than planned. In doing so, its carefully prepared timing, coordinated with shore-based air and logistics, shifted. The carriers and their screens arrived late to where they needed to be, under conditions that did not favor them, facing an American fleet ready to exploit air superiority. The destroyers that might have been screening those carriers were sitting on the bottom in or near the Sibutu Passage. Later, when men tried to explain why Japan's naval power had broken the way it did in 1944, they had to talk about numbers. They talked about steel tonnage. Japan's shipyards had built a finite number of destroyers before and during the war. Each one represented months of work, thousands of tons of steel, complex machinery that required years of training to operate and maintain. Replacing a single modern destroyer, once lost, was never a simple matter of putting another hull in the water. They talked about fuel. Every sortie burned precious oil that Japan could not easily replace. Destroyers, for all their slender lines, were thirsty at high speed. A hunting run at 30 knots did not show up in a ledger as a romantic act of aggression. It showed as barrels consumed and range lost. They talked about crews. A good destroyer division was not just hardware. It was teams of men who had sailed together, learned each other's habits, and survived long enough to develop a rhythm. Sonar operators who knew how to interpret a fuzzy echo, depth charge handlers who could feel a pattern in their bones. These were assets that could not be trained in a month or two. From the American side, the submarine campaign against Japanese shipping is often summarized in gross tonnage sunk and supply lines strangled. But within that broad chokehold, there was a particular arithmetic to the destruction of destroyers. Harder's 5th War Patrol, in a span of days, removed or crippled a handful of those specialized hunter ships in exactly the region where they were needed most, to protect the fleet concentrating for a decisive battle. Whether the final count is given as 3 sunk and 2 damaged or 5 destroyers in 4 days, as the Medal of Honor citation phrases it, the effect on the ratio was undeniable. Bak Koa Toan thu Wikipedia. Each destroyer lost in those waters did not just subtract 1 hull from the screen. It multiplied risk for every other ship that had to pass through the straits. It forced commanders either to accept thinner coverage or to pull escorts from other duties, weakening convoys elsewhere. The margins narrowed. On the American side, the mathematics of submarine deployment moved the other way. By mid-1944, the United States was commissioning new fleet boats at a steady pace, backed by an industrial base that could turn out engines, batteries, torpedoes, and spare parts on a scale the Japanese shipbuilding program could not match. Crews rotated, but they did so into a system that preserved and spread experience, not one constantly scrambling to replace dead officers and lost specialists. The numbers behind Dealey's personal record tell a similar story. 6 patrols. 16 confirmed ships sunk. Just over 54,000 tons of enemy shipping sent down, placing him near the top tier of American submarine skippers. Each of those sinkings was an individual drama. Taken together, they represented a steady application of pressure that, added to hundreds of other captains' efforts, eroded Japan's ability to move oil, troops, and supplies. Bak Koa Toan thu Wikipedia. In isolation, one submarine's audacious patrol could be mistaken for an outlier, a legend out of proportion to its importance. In the cold arithmetic of war, it was one entry in a ledger full of similar entries. What made Harder's 5th Patrol stand out was the way it intersected with a critical moment in the larger campaign. Destroyers lost in the Sibutu Passage helped strip away Japan's flexibility at exactly the time it needed clear, defended lanes for its fleet to concentrate. The early movement from Tawi-Tawi, prompted in part by fear of submarines, disrupted Japanese timing and contributed to the outcome in the Philippine Sea. Out in those open waters, American carrier air groups tore into a fleet that was late, poorly coordinated, and already bleeding escorts. No single patrol decided the war, but the numbers that underpinned Japan's naval power hulls, fuel, trained crews, had been drifting downward for years. Harder's brief storm around Tawi-Tawi accelerated that drift in a place where the curves were already unforgiving. From a distance, the mathematics of defeat looks like a chart, lines crossing, one descending as the other rises. At sea level, it looked like a Gato-class submarine slipping back into the deep, listening to the fading echoes of yet another destroyer breaking apart, and then turning her bow toward the next patrol area. When Harder went out again on her 6th patrol, the pattern ended. On 24 August 1944, off Luzon, in yet another piece of contested water, Japanese escort ships rolled patterns of depth charges over a submarine contact. One of those charges, or several, found their mark. Harder did not come back from that depth. 79 men, including Samuel Dealey, vanished into a silence that, for decades, held their final resting place beyond reach. Bak Koa Toan Tu Wikipedia. The boat's record was tallied. Citations were written. The Medal of Honor, delayed by inter-service disputes and paperwork, was eventually presented to Dealey's widow. Other decorations, for him and for his crew, followed. In the photo archives, he is frozen in black and white, a lean-faced officer in a service cap, eyes narrowed as if still watching some distant horizon. The legend of Hit 'em Harder, the destroyer killer, settled into books, plaques, and sea stories told in wardrooms. Submariners of later generations learned the basics. 1 boat, 5 destroyers in 4 days, a patrol some call the most brilliant of the war. The details blurred as they always do in memory, but the core remained. A single submarine that, for a short stretch of days, turned the logic of the hunter and the hunted inside out. For the Japanese sailors who survived those days, the memory would have been different. They had seen destroyers, steel they had trusted, lifted out of the water by explosions they never quite saw coming. The belief that sonar screens and depth charge rails made them safe would have cracked, if not shattered, when they realized that the submarine they thought they were charging had already taken aim and fired. Decades later, in 2024, survey vessels working over deep water in the region confirmed a sonar trace and a set of images. A long hull resting on the seabed more than 3,000 feet down, conning tower damaged, stern marked by the scars of depth charges. The wreck of USS Harder had been found. The boat lay intact enough to be recognized, broken enough to remind observers that men had died there doing their work. NavyTimes.com. For some of the older men who had served in submarines themselves, that discovery closed a circle. The war graves on the ocean floor, long left undisturbed, were being located not to pry them open, but to mark them properly. The logic of steel, oil, and time had run its course. All that remained was memory. The story of Harder's 4 days near Tawi-Tawi fits a pattern that runs through much of the Second World War at sea. A system that believed in its own models met a reality it had not fully imagined. A smaller, less glamorous arm of a navy, submarines, in this case, quietly accumulated skill, technology, and doctrine until, at some critical point, it became capable of reshaping events larger than any single patrol. The lesson is not that courage or daring alone decide battles. Harder's patrol was brave, but it was also the product of improved torpedoes, better training, and a wider Allied strategy that knew how to use her. On the other side, Japanese destroyer crews were brave as well, but they were trapped inside a system that demanded more of them than their fuel, industry, and doctrine could sustain. For the readers who knew diesel exhaust in their lungs, who had heard the sound of steel under pressure or the ring of a ship's bell at sea, this story is not abstract. It rests in details. The feel of a periscope handle, the smell of paint and oil in a destroyer's passageway, the heavy thump of a depth charge leaving the rack. It reminds them that wars are fought and decided not just in orders and strategies, but in how men and machines meet each other in specific pieces of water under specific skies. And it leaves one lasting image: a quiet submarine, running on batteries in a narrow strait under a bright moon, turning not away from the charging destroyer but toward it, trusting that the reality of torpedo, steel, and skill would prove stronger than the old belief about who hunted whom.